Do you like to play pool or maybe billiards or snooker if you're in the United Kingdom? If so, then today's episode of Life's Potluck Buffet may be for you because I'm going to talk about a curious history about spinning the ball. And we're going to ask the cards to put a little spin of their own on how we look at our work and lives. I'm John Paulus. You're listening to Life's Potluck Buffet only on YouTube. If you've been enjoying Life's Potluck Buffet, please subscribe. And if you've already subscribed, thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. If you have a Brave browser, you can now contribute basic attention tokens to Life's Potluck Buffet with John Paulus on YouTube. Thank you for your support, and thank you for listening. I have to say, I'm familiar with what in the United States what we call pool, which is a form of pocket billiards, where there's 6 pockets on a table. And in the U.S., the most common forms are 8-ball, where there are 16 balls, and that includes the cue ball that you hit the other balls with. And the reason it's called 8-ball is because the black 8-ball is important to winning the game. And there's also 9-ball, which is that's actually with 9 ball, well, 10 balls, I guess, including the cue ball, but 9 balls that have numbers on them. And the 9-ball there is the reason it's called 9-ball, because it's important. To winning the game is the 9-ball is the key ball there. So the games in the U.S. Of pocket billiards are very common. Less common, although you do see it around the country, are carom billiards, which the caroms are involved. What's a carom? Well, a carom is when something bounces off of something else or multiple things, and like a ball bounces off of something. And the word carom actually comes from the word in Malay for star fruit. And that comes from ultimately a Sanskrit word. And the star fruit, it was known to the Portuguese through Southeast Asia, and the star fruit there, and they called it in Portuguese. They took the word from Malay and they called it a carambola. And the carambola is the word that's used for the hitting 3 cushions on a billiards table, which is important to the scoring of carom billiards because there are really only 3 balls. There's a red ball and 2 white balls, one that has a dot on it, so that you know the difference between the white balls. And that's the caroming, and having the ball hit the cushions and bounce off and hit another cushion and bounce off. That's important to scoring points in, carom billiards. There's another type of billiard cue sport, as they are called, and that is snooker, which is a invention apparently of a British military officer that combines elements of some of these other games and added different colored balls of various types, but they don't have numbers on them. They're just solid color, but no numbers. And it's a game that's to people like myself who are only familiar really with the U.S. style pool billiards, 8-ball, 9-ball, etc. It's very confusing to look at and very interesting to see what is involved. It's kind of much more complex in a certain way. Or snooker, as they say in the UK. But if you've played any of these games, then you have used what is called a cue, which is the stick that you hit the ball with, and the ball you hit in many cases is called the cue ball in English because it's not because it's a cue, it's because the cue stick is what you hit the cue ball with. And the cue as a stick comes apparently from an old practice. And it's not certain whether this is a legendary story or whether this is actually why you call this that. But the original form of these games, these table games with balls and sticks, used a stick that looked apparently a little bit like an old-timey golf club with a kind of club head at the end. It was called a mace, but it wasn't a mace like the maces that are used in ceremonial things or maces that you see in maybe a lot in ancient art. It was a kind of mace that had a head that was at a slight angle, maybe a 75-degree angle to the shaft of the stick. And that was used like a kind of foot, or if you put your hand out and you tip your hand up at a 75-degree angle, kind of like that. If your arm is the stick and the hand is the head of the mace, and that was used to push balls rather than like striking the ball the way you do today with your cue. And the legendary story of how that became a cue is that when the ball was up against the cushion, it's those sides there, you couldn't really push it with the mace head, so you had to use the tail end of the stick. And that's what started getting used to just hit the ball in general. And an old French word for a straight thing that is kind of like a tail is cue, which comes from the Latin cauda or coda, which is a Latin word for a tail. And that is where we get the word cue in terms of line, in the UK where you use the word cue for what we call in the US a line, and because it's a line like a tail. And the same thing is true for old time hairdos from the 1800s, where there's a kind of the short, maybe braided ponytail or a pigtail in terms of hair. That is also called a cue, and so for the same reason, because it's a tail, like pigtail or ponytail. And that's the legendary story behind why a cue stick is called a cue. Now, these cues, these early cues, the mace as they're called, and then the one that didn't have the mace head on the end, just the straight cue stick, didn't have tips on them as they do today. If you look at a modern cue in any of the cue sports, you'll see that there's a leather tip on it. And the leather tip has an interesting history that's both shrouded in mystery, and also I think we could come to some sense of why the story about that leather tip on the cue is the story that is told. And that story starts at a place that is now part of one of the Parisian hospital systems, but was an infamous place in the 18th century. And that place is in the suburbs of Paris, and it's called Bicêtre. And it is most famous, perhaps, for being the place that the mental health, I'll say reformer, Philippe Pinel, began to make the conditions of French mental health institutions less like prisons and more like hospitals. And this is something where I think the legend has lost a bit of what may be the facts behind the story. So the legend of the invention of the leather Q-tip is that a French infantry captain known as Francois Mangot, was placed in Bicêtre as a political prisoner for being mixed up with a conspiracy or a conspirator who attempted to blow up Napoleon's carriage while Napoleon was on the way to the opera and had fallen asleep. And that in itself is a famous story of psychiatric history, because Freud and others spent a lot of words interpreting Napoleon's dream that Napoleon said that he had before the incident of the attempted assassination through an incendiary device as basically a version of a bomb called an infernal machine, which is basically a barrel filled with gunpowder and projectiles and so forth, and it's fired from a distance and explodes, and the whole thing causes a lot of damage. And in this case, were many casualties in the area, including a young woman who was killed, and many injuries as well. The one person who survived it was Napoleon, and word apparently spread very quickly, and by the time Napoleon had reached the opera, apparently received an ovation of the opera goers when they saw him appear in his box. And these were the kind of circles that Mangot was involved in. And so he was arrested and put into Bicêtre. Now, here's the thing about Bicêtre. Another famous inmate of Bicêtre, briefly, was the infamous Marquis de Sade. And reading between the lines, I think that the Bicêtre was being used as a mental prison rather than just a political prison or a mental asylum, as it was called then. And that ties into the Pinel Reformation story. Basically, he's reforming a place that was functioning as a combination of a mental asylum, prison, and a place of recovery as well. And later on, it would be very common for these places of recovery to have billiard tables and bowling alleys. Oh, remember bowling from the other episode? A sport thought to have had the exact right healthful effect, so long as you weren't gambling on it. And I suspect if the story is true about Mangot perfecting his pool shooting skills at Bicêtre, then Bicêtre certainly would have had these innovative recreational games available for inmates, as they were called at the time. And that very well may have been due to the attitudes of Pinel and his successors and students who were in charge when Mangot was incarcerated. Well, when Mangot was at Bicêtre, he is said to have perfected his pool playing and his trick shots, and that's what he became famous for later on. And the reason he was able to perform these trick shots was because he developed or used, if he didn't develop it directly, used a leather tip on the cue that prevent what was called, and may still be called today in English, a miscue, where you hit the cue stick shoots off to the side and the ball kind of barely moves, that kind of thing. That would happen a lot. And then what they did is they rounded the wood tip, and so it happened a little less. But then with the addition of a leather tip on top of that, all of a sudden miscues were a lot less common. And not only were they a lot less common, but you could then do trick shots because you could put spin on the ball. So when Mangot was let out of Bicêtre, he started to go around France as the early 1800s version of a pool shark and a hustler and a trick shot master. And he even published a book about how to do trick shots, showing where on the cue ball to strike and how to strike it in order to make the ball spin, etc. He is also credited with the form of trick shooting called masse, M-A-S-S-E with an accent, acute accent, aiguë. And that is from the French word for the mace that was originally used. And the idea is that when you use the mace, you're at quite an angle to the ball. And when you do the masse trick shot, and that's where the ball really curves like a super amount, or it's just like these crazy kind of shots where the ball spins a ton and does all sorts of, kind of seemingly impossible things. And the way you do that is you hit the ball from almost the kind of top of it to impart a tremendous amount of spin on it. And that's called masse, which means maced. And so that's the idea, is that was related to that early form of mace because of the angle at which you're striking the ball. And Mangot is thought to be the person who really developed and pioneered these techniques of masse. Well, we won't ask the cards for a trick shot, but let's see what tricks they have up their sleeves today. So cards, you ready? Do you have sleeves? Yellow lemons, blue dumplings, magenta noodles, cards. Tell us some things. Okay. There we go. Wow. As usual, I'm amazed. Thank you, cards. It's card number 2. All the ships belong to you. This card number 2 is about an ancient story about a man with a mental illness that made him believe all the cargo ships going in and out of a port belonged to him. So he would spend his days at the harbor and greet his ships happily when they came into port. And when he was cured of his mental illness, he would tell people the story of how happy his life was when he was a shipping magnate. And it was all pleasure and no pain. So think about your port, where that port is, what you're doing, what the ships are, and fill in this blank. It would be crazy if blank. And then know that you will do that in the future and feel the joy. And I'll see you tomorrow on Life's Potluck Buffet.